And my thanks also to Doctors Harbinder Sahota and Dr. Sulek Jain for supporting this program. So I'm going to give you just a glimpse into where I'm going rather than a detailed, coherent talk. Some of the thoughts that I'm sort of putting together are helping me to teach about violence in a slightly different way than I have done before, but also to shift some of these ideas towards research on the notion of sovereignty that you'll see popping up in this in this talk. So I'm hoping that the slides all come up as they should. So I've entitled this Sikhism's Non-Violent War Machine. The idea of the war machine is something I take from Gilles Deleuze's work, and it means precisely the opposite of what it says. So you think we're talking about something that creates war, it's actually the exact opposite. Just gesture to me if you think my voice is sort of fading away or whatever. So let me begin by talking about the representation of violence in Sikhism. And I'll begin with just talking a little bit about documentaries, two very popular documentaries that have come out in the last 15, 20 years have been The Six, a 1999 documentary, and then a documentary called 1984, A Sikh Story by Sonia Deol. And one thing that's really quite remarkable about these is the level of the kind of coherence with academic discourse, and particularly this focus on representing violence as a movement from pacifism to violence in the Sikh tradition. It kind of follows a kind of teleological perspective. So there's a kind of conventional narrative of the historical evolution of violence from the quietist idea, the notion of a quietist origin of Sikhism, which begins with Guru Nanak, towards the more militant aspects of the faith with Guru Gobind Singh. So there's a shift from pacifism to militancy, from a kind of normative, original, authentic religious state to a deviant state, a fallen, inauthentic religion. And this is a really problematic narrative which has become embedded into academic studies and also is constantly repeated in the media. And in this narrative, one of the things that I'm going to question is the role of the state form. The state form as a keeper of that peace, whether it's in the Mughal era, whether it's in the British imperial era, or in modern India. That basically that violence is only perpetrated by deviant secondary actors who are kind of seduced into worldly desire for power. I'm going to problematize that whole narrative and try to show a different way of working with violence. And one of the reasons for doing this is that I'm kind of writing this short book. It's one of the Cambridge are doing a new series on violence in world religions. And it immediately struck me as I was beginning to write this, how on earth do I, first of all, deal with this conventional notion of violence, which kind of seeps into everything? So the problem here is that these representations of violence are completely at odds with the textual sources of the Sikh tradition and also with Sikh memory and practice. And you have to take those two aspects seriously. And it depends how you look at those aspects in particular. So let me just talk about the conventional understanding of violence. So the conventional understanding of violence, we all know what violence is, or we're supposed to know what violence is when we see it. So violence is directly visible. It's performed by an agent that you can immediately identify, and so things like religious terrorism, international conflicts, and civil unrests are, some of the key things that are identified, and so this is coming out of partly out of Zizek and partly out of Walter Benjamin's critiques of violence. That what we see is a subjective violence, which becomes the conventional idea of representations of violence. And what I want to do is to draw upon the work of people like Walter Benjamin and Slavoj Zizek and others, but particularly Gilles Deleuze, to provide a more critical approach to violence. And that critical approach involves making visible that an invisible mode of violence, which is to do with representation, the language that we use to talk about violence, and of course, the frame within which we represent, which is historical time, secular historical time. As talking specifically in relation to the work of Zizek, what we have to do is to shift our perspective back onto our modes of representation to bring into view two hidden forms of violence. So we already see subjective, visible violence, and what we have to do is to make visible an invisible violence, which is actually the objective violence, which becomes systemic particularly in all forms of the state. And the one that I'm going to focus on, which is part of the objective violence, is the idea of symbolic violence, which is to do with language, our thought patterns, and how they become completely normative. So, as I said, I'm engaged in writing this volume on Sikhism. And really, as I was writing it, the only way you can write it is to kind of write a history of Sikhism. But then, there's a real problem here. As you write history, as you accept the normativity of secular time and that mode of consciousness that you're working within, it silences the traditional sources. And that's partly what I was trying to do here, and why I've hit on the idea of the war machine, to try and use that to leverage a deeper understanding of the traditional sources. So as you can see here, the chapters go something like this: representing violence, and then sovereign violence. So instead of beginning with Guru Nanak, this chapter on sovereign violence is actually just a standard history of Guru Nanak. But I've called it sovereign violence because I think the idea of a deeper, a more interior violence, which is actually non-violent violence, or the non-violence of the war machine, is something that I call sovereign violence, and that has to do with Guru Nanak, that quietist figure. So it's somewhere in that quietism that I'm trying to tease out this thing. And then the usual chapters on the shift into martyrdom, militarization, the Khalsa mythos, the creation of the Sikhs as a martial race in the modern period, and of course, no book on violence would be complete without reference to the 1984 episode, the Sikh conflict with the Indian state, the modern Indian state. And then I finish with this chapter on the war machine. What exactly is it? And where does violence actually lie in the Sikh tradition? So the basic problem that I was facing here was the editorial demand. The editors demand that I present the phenomenon of violence. It's there. You should be able to just pick it out and show everybody what it is. So the problem for me was to avoid violence as teleological, this movement from pacifism to violence. And the challenge was to try and reconcile the actual events of Sikh political history with the virtual event that is Sikh spirituality. And here, anybody familiar with Deleuze will see that that is a kind of Deleuzean tactic here, the distinction between the actual and the virtual. These are actually two different modes of ontology, two different forms of time. They're equally real, but the virtual belongs in a different time that is every bit part of our world today. It's just that it isn't seen. it's overlain by our kind of egotistical representations. And the problem that I'm facing here is that it has to do with the meaning of violence. The meaning of violence has already been framed for at least 300 years, 300 or 400 years, and it's coming from within the language that we're using to write about these other traditions, which of course is the kind of Western language. So let me move from there to talk briefly about framed violence, how to make visible that invisible frame. So bringing the state form's invisible field of interiority into view. So this is, so as I said, I'm kind of putting this together, and it's a lot of different pieces from the jigsaw that I'm trying to put together here. How is the concept of violence framed? First of all, I start thinking about the creation myth of the modern state. As the modern state was born with the shift from the church to the state, it brings in an ontological and therefore a temporal distinction between church and state, which actually redefines not just the meaning of religion, but actually the meaning of violence itself. And that never comes into view. It's the redefinition of the meaning of violence, which goes hand in hand with the meaning of religion, that is very, very problematic indeed. And central to that is the work of symbolic violence. This is the violence that's embedded within the language. So once this ontological distinction gets instituted into law, the state has basically assumed responsibility for guarding against any violation, which means that it assumes a monopoly not only over physical violence, but over the very meaning of violence as such. In other words, violence is by definition the desecration of the divine, or a deviation from sacred origins. By doing so, the state exerts a symbolic violence, a violence that's embedded within the structures of language, of speech, and of thought. And of course, this becomes entirely normative. And to use a phrase from the nomadology plateau by Deleuze and Guattari, the state was basically born fully armed. In other words, it's armed with the law. It has a monopoly on how we talk about violence, not just physical violence, but how we actually think and talk about it. And it's that which creates a kind of field of interiority. So it creates a mode of representation and thinking, which essentially reduces any kind of difference to the kind of identity that's sanctioned by the state form. And here, what I'm going to do, and I haven't completely worked this out in the book, but I'm kind of working this out as I kind of go along, is the use of the idea of state form as something which can be talked about in the Mughal context, the British imperial context, and also in the modern Indian context. So there is a kind of a unity of composition that where you can apply this not just to the modern state, but to pre-modern states as well. So when I talk about the state form as a field of interiority, what I'm saying is that it monopolizes the way in which people are allowed to make social relations, interact with each other. And that, I think, goes to the heart of the early Sikh sources, which talk about the kind of relations that Guru Nanak was trying to create between Hindu and Muslim. So let me just move from here and reiterate again that this field of interiority is completely in opposition to the sources of the Sikh tradition, which provide a radically different model of violence that cannot be recognized by the state form. So, composing the element, non-violent war machines, how to resist the conventional notion of violence? Well, very simply, I mean, there's nothing really technical about this, I just go and read the sources more carefully. So the first thing is to reread the sources that challenge conventional notions of violence. The Janam Sakhi is very, very crucial. Gurbani itself, the writings of Guru Nanak, and of course, how those two elements are represented in contemporary Katha, which is an aspect of Sikh memory. And my argument is that violence actually occupies a structural aspect of Sikh interpretive tradition, but this is not conventional violence. This is a much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Hybrid notion of violence that brings non-violence and violence into one form. The second thing, in order to resist conventional notions of violence, is to recover what I call the excessive impulse in the Guru period, in those 200 years from Guru Nanak to Guru Gobind Singh, which is really important. So it's this excessive impulse that's associated with the house of Nanak and the name Nanak himself. And it's this excessive impulse which refuses to be captured by the state form. And that's all that Sikh history in that early period is largely about. Why does this excessive impulse in and associated with Nanak come into conflict with the state? Why couldn't he just be a good quietist spiritual figure and do his meditation? You know, what brings him into conflict and his later successors into conflict? So I think there's a need to look at Guru Nanak's early life and teaching in more detail, to look at the martyrdoms of Guru Arjan and Guru Tegh Bahadur, and also Guru Gobind Singh's creation of the Khalsa. Now, I'm not going to do any of these in detail here. We'd be here all day. I'm just going to give you an idea of into where I'm actually kind of working with these. So, how do you recover a mode of violence that's excessive to the state form? First of all, I think it's important to the textual sources of Sikh tradition point to a form of sovereignty that's irreducible to the state form. And this excessive impulse is located in not just the figures of guruship, the 10 living gurus and the scriptural text, but in the transmission of authority and the transmission of sovereignty. And that's precisely what's depicted in images like this. The alternative sovereignty that I'm talking about can be envisaged as competing forms of violence. There is the sovereign violence tied to the institution of guruship and to the concept of guru. It's very, very important, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. And that is competing with the violence of the state form. Whether it's the Mughal state, it can be the British imperial state or the Indian state. Doesn't really matter. Because the state form, its function is to concentrate external physical violence to itself, to concentrate sovereignty to itself. And it's this that creates this distinction between the subjective pacifism of Guru Nanak and the subjective violence of the later gurus. So let's just talk a little bit about sovereign violence. What exactly is it? So where would I go as I'm writing the element? It's important to look at what was happening to Guru Nanak at the ages of 12, between 12 and 17, at the age of 30, and then just before he dies at the age of 70 as well. And what I'm pointing to in the element that I'm writing is Nanak's excessive spirituality, the fact that it's resistant to social norms. And if you read the Janam Sakhis very carefully, that's what is coming out. The resistance to social norms, a very deep concern with cultural difference. How to bridge this gap. I mean, the spirituality comes out of that. It is entirely cultural. So there are mentions of frequent trances and silences, and what we've seen, especially in the last 150 years, is a kind of Protestantization of this mode of spirituality into the typical form of interiority. And then when Nanak, at the age of 30, has the Sultanpur, the experience where he goes silent for 3 days and then comes out of that silence, and all he can say is no Hindu, no Muslim. Of course, this is a form of violence to that social norm, precisely that he doesn't recognize identities. He recognizes the ability of differences to be reconciled, to be living together. And that's the key thing. But where is that located? It's actually located, and it cannot come from outside. It's located within ego formation. And where is the evidence for that? It's in all of the shubads. It's in his writings. Read the shubads in relation to the Janamsakhi accounts, and it's a very clear picture that emerges of a struggle with ego formation, where Guru Nanak is creating a new psychic structure that balances ego with ego loss, a kind of self-differentiating subjectivity. That's what comes across all throughout the Sikh scriptures and in these kind of writings, and particularly the ability to formulate social relations that the state form cannot capture. I'll come back to this in the next slide as well. So sovereign violence, what I mean by sovereign violence is violence that is internal to spiritual experience. It's a non-annihilating violence against one's own ego. It's literally the struggle with one's ego, okay? So Guru Nanak will use the words like shabad as a tool or a sword to kill the ego, the word that kills. The basic characteristic is that it is totally exterior to the state form. And this is where I kind of bring in the war machine concept, because that's almost exactly what Deleuze is doing with this particular concept. And I'll talk about that in a second. So what do I mean by sovereign violence? I'm just going to put this image up here to illustrate what I mean by this. And the Sikhs will know straight away where this is kind of coming from. If you imagine the line that goes up here, the vertical line, is normal ego development, and then the line that goes downwards towards the real is the way of pure asceticism, withdrawal from the world. What this sovereign violence is doing is bringing these two forms, these two modes of existence together. It's doing a violence against one's own ego and a violence against the non-ego as well. And you can map this very interestingly onto what Guru Nanak is saying in Gurbani itself. So I wish I could point to it here, but the top curve is basically ego loss through the Shabad, experiencing the Shabad, the unheard Shabad as the Satguru, and the bottom line, which curves upwards, is emerging from silence. So these are two forms of psychic rehabilitation, if you like, which result in the figure that Guru Nanak eulogizes as the Gurmukh, or the self-differentiating subject, or the spiritual warrior. This is a form of being that is constantly becoming. It can never be captured as an identity. And that is one of the problems that, unfortunately, Sikhs have kind of run into, is that they think that the Khalsa, for example, is the same as the Gurmukh, which it completely isn't. This is an unending project of constant self-renewal. And that's in complete opposition to the egotistical subject, or the Manmukh. And I'm just taking this straight from Gurbani and putting it onto this kind of psychological map here. Just makes it a little easier to see. So sovereign violence, I think of it as the war machine. So I want to just characterize the notion of the war machine a little further now. So first of all, we have to think about the state form. The state form is an apparatus of capture that creates fields of interiority, as I've just said. It's characterized by its unifying composition, the fact that it forces identification in a particular way. And it monopolizes power by concentrating sovereignty to itself, by controlling how people interrelate. The war machine, on the other hand, is that excessive impulse that I was talking about, which is not amenable to control by any state form. It's altogether different in nature to the state form. And it really is about an assemblage or a kind of set of forces produced through this sovereign violence, which counteracts the sovereignty of the state form and instead enables alternative connections to be formed. So whether you're Hindu, Sikh, Jain, or whatever, or Christian, you can form these relations despite your differences. And it's a real formation of differences, not into a kind of superficial identity as we have in secularist discourse through the notion of tolerance, which is like really fragile. It can be broken through very, very quickly. There are other ways of thinking about synthesizing differences, and I think these spiritual figures like Nanak do that internally first. So it can only come from an internal self-differentiation. So difference never comes from the outside, it always comes from inside out. So what does the war machine concept actually do? It's like an engine, if you like, and I really like the idea of the machinic concept. It's an engine that enables the association of differences, and these differences can only be associated if the self first undergoes internal differentiation. Now, I was arguing on this particular point in my previous book, The Religion and the Spectre of the West, actually arguing with and against Slavoj Zizek, who is arguing the exact opposite. If you read Zizek carefully, at several points in his work, lamenting on the failure of the left to produce anything intellectually kind of coherent in the 1990s, he basically said in a number of places that we have to continue to look to Western sources to particularly to go back to a certain form of Christianity to find ways of living together. And he completely dismissed Eastern traditions, Chinese and other traditions. And he was essentially using a kind of dialectical Hegelian model as the next thing that we can do. It's the only thing we can sort of play with. And, you know, my own work sort of challenges this, that he's missed something really crucial in bringing these two different forms of the psyche together, which is what these spiritual warriors do, irrespective of whether they're Christian mystics or Eastern mystics. It doesn't really matter. And actually, even if you're not attached to any religious tradition either, it's possible to go through that experience and come out with something similar. So what the war machine concept does is that it allows us to counter these teleological evolutionary accounts of history where violence enters externally from the state or from subjective actors. So the blame is always put on a particular subjective actor. And it also counters the religion decline thesis from sacred origins. So you once had, you know, a tradition that's absolutely pure, and then as people start interacting in the world of time, you have this kind of deviation from that. I mean, it's a very Platonic kind of thesis here. So to see Nanak as a spiritual warrior provides the qualitative example of sovereign violence. And Nanak, in a sense, becomes a war machine. And that's why I'm using this concept here. I think it works really well. Nanak may be quietist. He may not have entered into physical violence at all, but in that sense, he is absolutely doing what a war machine does, whose engine is self-differentiation based on ego loss, self-surrender, love, devotion. And I think there's a need for us to work with these terms that are normally associated with religious traditions and bring them uh, into interaction with kind of cultural theory, to infuse cultural theory, which I think is kind of bereft of a lot of this um, rich material. So how does the war machine get performed? How is sovereign violence performed? I've already indicated a little bit about Guru Nanak's spiritual experiences at an early age, but this picture on the bottom, uh, and most people will probably recognize this if you've done a short course in Sikhism, is that this is the point at the age of 70, just before he dies, where he prostrates himself before uh, his former disciple, who now becomes the guru. So he's transferring his spiritual mastery, his guruship, onto the next disciple, who now becomes guru. And what's interesting about that, and there's a link here to a scene in the Khalsa narrative as well, is the loss of divinity here by Nanak, the absolute self-surrender of oneself. And that's precisely what I'm talking about when I use these terms, war machine and sovereign violence. It's a violence to oneself, to one's sense of self, to one's sovereignty. And we see this repeated in the martyrdoms of Guru Arjan and Guru Tegh Bahadur. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but the one I will talk about very briefly is the scene of the Khalsa. So there's a link here, a very, very important link. Even though the imagery is a bit crass, you just look at this last image and then these two bottom images here, where Guru Gobind Singh is creating the Khalsa. The key part of the Khalsa narrative is the moment when Guru Gobind Singh, the 10th Guru, after creating the Khalsa, then goes down and on his knees and begs for initiation. In other words, he does the same as Nanak is doing, and he's become the disciple. So it's going from being a master, a totally sovereign, spiritual sovereign, he completely gives it up. And that's a performance that each of the gurus did. And Guru Gobind Singh very importantly did that, and it's a central aspect. And again, that's the war machine in action. So it kind of it throws a spanner into the works, really, when you're writing these, writing against the historical narrative. So how do we apply the war machine concept? Well, Sikh history, I think, can be seen from the perspective of the war machine or the spiritual warrior as a series of performances of sovereign violence. Or, and this goes against that trend, the way in which the state form continues to capture the war machine. Okay? So there is a kind of balance there which is always there. And I'll illustrate that in a second. So we've just seen this. So in the modern period, British colonial and Indian post-colonial states actually capture the war machine capacity of the Sikhs, of the Khalsa, in creating the Sikhs as a martial race, for example. That's completely constraining what it should be doing, and bringing it into the state's own sovereign apparatus for its own purposes. And of course, with the current Indian state, the Sikhs are regarded as the kind of sword arm of India. Same thing applies. Two instances where there is a break with this trend. The early history of the Akali Dal, where the Akalis in the 1920s are organizing these non-violent morchas or agitations against British rule. And this was a time, and during those 5 or 6 years, and these are the Akali, just a couple of images of the Akalis, they created Shahidi Jathas. martyrdom groups, basically. So they're courting arrest from the British government, and they walked in groups of five, five representative of the five of the Khalsa. And of course, this was a completely non-violent movement. They underwent a significant amount of violence themselves. Many of them were killed during that. And Gandhi was totally in touch with this whole process for a period of 4 or 5 years. And if you read the letters that Gandhi wrote to the Akali Dal, it's very clear that there's a real level of anxiety about whether these fully armed Shahidi Jathas are going to crack and take out the sword, when things get a little, difficult, and then break that whole sort of cycle of non-violent agitation. And in fact, they didn't. It was real credit to them at the time. And in fact, they did this again in the 80s as well, during the time of Indira Gandhi's rule, when she was running a virtual emergency, I think between, not just in 1975, but between 81 and 83. And Indira Gandhi's whole emphasis really was to derail this non-violent agitation. So it's where the Akali Dal really knew how to take the war machine capacity and do something with it. And that was a real threat to the state. So non-violent agitation, real threat to the the state. Let me just go back here. These are what I would call the captured war machine. So 6 soldiers in the service of the state. The first picture is from the Second Afghan War. And the second picture here is 6 soldiers in the First World War at a parade. And the bottom picture is 6 in the Indian Army. So again, it's capturing that excessive impulse and incorporating it into the state machinery. And the one I want to leave you with, and I think the jury is still out on this one, is what happened in 1984 with Janelle Singh Bhindranwale's last stand. And this is something that I'm still trying to get my head around as well, because in one sense, what Bhindranwale did was also to call out the Indian state, to push it, although he did so with both non-violence and excessive violence as well. So it's a very interesting example of where he clearly understands the capacities of the war machine, but where it can get derailed in that very process as well. And again, there's the jury is very much out there. So I'm going to leave it there. And the idea, just to recap, is just, for me, it was an exercise in how to rewrite history without writing history. Almost fell off here. So you can't do away with historical narrative, but you can find ways of just turning it aside, I guess, and showing things which it completely makes invisible otherwise. And one of those things is this notion of sovereign violence. And I think this is partly at the root of Sikh anxiety as well, with academic representations as well, that they just kind of fall into line with state forms. And it's something that I've tried to give credence to as well. And I have to constantly, in my own work, challenge myself not to fall into those sort of patterns as well. And for a time, I just refused to go onto the media whenever I got called, because I knew that whenever you're asked a question about violence, pacifism, etc., there's a way in which the question is already framed for you. The answer's already framed. How do you find the words and the thought patterns to kind of work your way out of that? This is what I'm getting at. So this book is still very much a challenge, and maybe a year from now I'll give you an idea of where it's gone. So thank you very much.
I just feel that I'm not adequate enough to give a question or a commentary because it's not, this is new discourse for me. But I fully agree with you that we indeed have a lot to learn from these ways of performing non-violent violence coming from the East. And I think that what you are doing is actually, it takes time to grasp because you are reversing what we in academia are not seeing. And this sovereign violence as a way of making visible the invisible oppressive forces that the state puts upon us, that we also as academics fall into, was very interesting for me. I really don't have a question because I was trying to follow your argument, and I don't know.
I actually wish I had an argument. It was just a set. It was just a set of ideas that I've managed just to put together. But I think I know where I'm going with this. But I honestly, I know it's not
I mean,
coherent.
because it's well, what it made me think actually is in bringing forth this way of performing sovereign violence, you are at the same time bringing forth the type of violence that the state is actually promoting without saying it, a violence that is a cruel violence that we don't see in the other forms of violence performed by spiritual warriors. That in making this invisible visible, what you might be doing also on the side of the state violence is actually characterizing, making us see that in not recognizing other types of violence, what the state is doing is normatizing the type of violence that is cruel, a cruel violence. So
Yeah, it's a good point.
even though you don't say that, that's one of the things that came
And
to me.
remember, I think the word violence can simply be substituted for sovereignty as well. So I'm also reversing the conventional understanding of sovereignty
Yeah,
as well. You know.
yeah. And there is an opposition that you are making, the type of ego that the state is the paradigm of is in opposition to the egoless ego that the spiritual warrior has, because and the impossibility of the state as this egotistical ego to give it up, because in giving up that ego, it would lose the grip upon us that doesn't want to let go. So by making that process visible, perhaps we can ungrip that force.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
I have much that I would like to say. I'm going to save my remarks for later, and I do want to keep in touch because what we find at stake here is a critique of culture, a critique of self, a critique of the trivialization that comes when the government and when corporations get very afraid because they want to control us and we want to control ourselves. I'm reminded of what Vandana Shiva pointed out when she was here about food and about the Punjab. And what has happened is that the hegemony of corporation has dictated what goes into our bodies. It's terrifying. And the greatest act of resistance takes us back to the Upanishads, that really food is God. And that to the extent that we have control over that which sustains us, we are violent revolutionaries, but the violence is not committed against person, but it is committed against the notion that we must be docile participants. Those images of the spiritual warriors moving with the British into Afghanistan and then moving with Indira Gandhi and into the present as the great warriors on behalf of nationalism, it's just plain sad. So, okay, thank you.